Dawn broke slowly over the rolling hills of Mississippi in the spring of 1871. The sky was a pale wash of orange and gray, clouds drifting lazily as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Yet the stillness that greeted the town's early risers told a different story. From the neighboring village of Whitmore, townspeople set out along the dirt paths, expecting to see smoke curling from chimneys, the familiar sound of cattle, and the occasional clatter of wagon wheels. Instead, they found silence, a silence so profound that it felt almost deliberate. Fires in hearths still smouldered, the scent of burnt wood and half-cooked bread lingering in the cool morning air. Doors were unlocked, swinging slightly in the gentle breeze. Pots sat on stoves, untouched. Laundry, still damp, flapped quietly on lines. And most chilling of all, there were no people. Not a single body could be found. Whatever had happened here did not happen slowly, and it did not happen quietly. The scene was frozen mid-life, as if someone had paused time itself. The villagers from Whitmore called out, their voices bouncing off empty walls, but only echoes returned. Dogs wandered aimlessly, apparently abandoned, and chickens pecked at the ground with no one to tend them. The air was thick with the scent of normalcy interrupted, a peace shattered in the most incomprehensible way. The first search parties began moving carefully through the village, stepping over the scattered belongings that hinted at a life suddenly abandoned. A pair of shoes lay by a doorway, a child's doll on the floor, a broom left standing against the wall. It was as though the villagers had simply vanished, leaving everything behind in a blur of haste or, perhaps under some unseen command. Among the baffled Whitmore citizens, a few older men whispered about past disappearances in other towns, unconnected rumors that had never been substantiated. They shook their heads, murmuring that this time it was different. The village had existed for over a century. Generations had lived there, had built their lives, married and buried their dead in consecrated ground. And yet, in 1871, the people were gone, leaving only shadows of their existence. The church, the heart of the village, loomed silently at its center. Its steeple reached toward the sky, intact and undisturbed, but no bell rang. According to local records, the church bell had been struck that night in evening service of sorts, but no one could recall hearing it. The weight of that silence was profound, hinting that the normal mechanisms of life and ritual had been interrupted in a way that defied reason. Investigators, historians, and later, curious onlookers would note the details that suggested an eerie normalcy before the disappearance. Bread was half-baked, hearths still warm, and fields untended. Horses were still tied to posts. Wagons sat in the village square, wheels spinning lazily in the breeze. Every detail suggested a life interrupted mid-motion, an ordinary morning that had been frozen. And yet, the absence of human presence created a tension that no photograph or description could fully convey. It was only when the church records were examined that the first real clue of something more sinister emerged. The registry, which had documented every birth, baptism, and marriage for decades, showed entries that had been updated after the villagers were already gone. Names were crossed off, spaces left blank where details should have been. Notes in the margins were cryptic, almost indecipherable, hinting at events that no one could verify. It was as if the record itself had become an instrument of concealment, a deliberate rewriting of history, to make people disappear not only physically, but administratively. Whispers began circulating among those who had come to investigate. Some suggested that the village had been abandoned in a mass migration, a sudden exodus caused by fear or threat. Others proposed natural disaster, disease, or famine. Yet none of these explanations could account for the sheer perfection of the scene. No bodies, no tracks, no signs of struggle. The village was empty, yet every object told a story of people who had simply stopped being there. One man, an amateur historian who had spent years documenting Mississippi's smaller communities, noted that even the livestock and domestic animals showed no signs of panic. Dogs were calm, chickens pecking, and horses waiting patiently at their posts. This suggested not chaos, but planned absence. Someone or something had ensured that the village emptied without violence or destruction, leaving only the ghost of life behind by late morning. The first official teams arrived, documenting every detail with meticulous care. They photographed hearths, doors, and the church steeple. They measured distances between houses, noting the absence of any footprints leading out of town. The air was filled with the low murmur of speculation, the scribble of notes on paper, and the quiet hum of disbelief. And as each observer recorded what they saw, the enormity of the mystery became apparent. This was not merely a disappearance. This was an erasure. It would take decades for historians to fully understand the implications of that morning. The vanished village became a subject of speculation, folklore, and later, scholarly investigation. But for those first few hours, the people who stumbled upon it could do little more than stare at the abandoned streets and wonder what force could remove an entire community without a trace, leaving behind only the echo of ordinary life. And that was the moment investigators realized. This wasn't a disappearance. It was an erasure. Every detail, from the unbaked bread to the empty church pews, spoke of lives that had been deliberately wiped from existence, not just physically, but from memory and record. The village had ceased to exist, yet all its traces hinted at the profound human presence that had once been there, now silenced in a way that would haunt anyone who came after, even today. Scholars examining the surviving church records, maps, and oral accounts from neighboring towns can feel the weight of that day. The morning no one woke up had left behind a riddle so complete that every subsequent investigation only revealed how carefully reality itself had been manipulated. And while the answers remained elusive, one truth was clear: the village had not simply vanished, had been made to vanish. Maps, official surveys, and government documents all seemed to ignore the village entirely. Step back far enough on any 19th century map of Mississippi, and this settlement simply disappeared, replaced by blank fields or unnamed roads. Yet according to the surviving church records, the village had existed for 143 years. Every birth, baptism, marriage, and funeral meticulously noted in ink that had survived decades, all pointing to a thriving community that had, apparently, never existed at all in the eyes of the world. The village had been small, no more than a few dozen households, but it was full of life and ritual. Morning routines were simple and repetitive, women rising at dawn to stoke fires, children scrambling to fetch water from the well, men tending the fields or sharpening tools for the day's labor. Families were close-knit, with names appearing repeatedly in church registers: the Carters, the Millers, the Hull. Each generation seemed to build upon the last, marking marriages and births in the same script, the same hand, creating a chain of life that spanned well over a century. Everywhere the villagers went, the church stood as the center of daily existence. Its steeple was visible from nearly every home, a constant reminder of faith, community, and shared history. Services were held twice a week, with additional gatherings for holidays and baptisms. The bell tolled for weddings and funerals alike, and the parishioners treated it as the heartbeat of their lives. Children learned hymns from an early age, their voices echoing through the village square during evening practices. Even in moments of routine, a visitor could sense the devotion that held this village together, and yet, beneath the surface of normalcy, small irregularities had begun to appear, though no one at the time seemed to notice or question them. Birth records, which had consistently documented each child for generations, suddenly stopped. Families that should have had children in certain years simply went unrecorded. Death records, which should have naturally increased over time, remained curiously flat. The ledger's pages suggested a life of continuity, but something had begun to unravel quietly, imperceptibly, as investigators later pored over these old records. They noticed that one name appeared more often than any other: Father Elias Thornwood. He was the village priest responsible for recording baptisms, marriages, and deaths. And yet there was something peculiar about him. His signature, precise and deliberate, continued to appear even months after the village had vanished. The ledger showed his hand marking confessions, attending to rituals, and noting obligations, but there was no evidence that Elias Thornwood existed outside these records. No birth certificate, no census entry, no obituary. Only the village's church books bore witness to his presence. The daily life of the village, as reconstructed from these records, was both ordinary and strangely formalized. Families maintained gardens and livestock. Children were schooled in reading, writing, and hymns, and community gatherings marked the rhythm of each week. There were festivals and fairs, seasonal harvests, and long evenings by the hearth where stories were shared. Yet all of this ordinary life now exists only in fragments, photographs that never were taken, stories that were never fully told, memories passed down from neighboring towns that had been scattered with time. A visitor to the village in its final days might have perceived nothing out of the ordinary. Doors were locked at night, chores were completed on schedule, and no one seemed to question the pattern of life. Yet the irregularities in the church records were like tiny fissures in the surface of calm water, evidence that beneath the veneer of normalcy, something was shifting. Names disappeared and reappeared. Records were annotated in cryptic ways, and certain families were noted for absence without explanation. While no one in the village appeared to voice concern, investigators much later realized that these subtle clues had been the first indication that the ordinary rhythm of life was about to be disrupted in ways no one could have imagined. By the time the neighboring townspeople arrived, the village was already gone. Houses stood empty, fields untended, and the church doors were locked from the inside. Yet the church records told a different story. They continued to be updated, as if the village had persisted somewhere beyond physical reality. And always, Father Elias Thornwood's name appeared. He seemed to act as a custodian of this impossible timeline, bridging the gap between what had been and what was meant to disappear. This contradiction, physical absence of people versus the continuing activity of records, was the first real signal that the story was far darker than a simple disappearance. The village had existed. The lives within it had been real, measurable, documented, and cherished. And yet, in one night, everything had been erased from the tangible world, leaving only the inked traces of what had been. As researchers later examined these records, they realized the significance of the pattern. Every family accounted for, every life noted in precise detail, yet none remained to witness the next day. Even as ordinary life unfolded in predictable cycles, the ledger suggested a deliberate interruption, a pause in existence orchestrated with meticulous care. And always the same hand marked the pages, ensuring that the story, though invisible in the world, would survive in some record, some trace of reality. In this part of the story, we begin to understand the tension between life as it was lived and life as it was erased. The village had existed, but only partially. In maps it was blank, in memory it was fading, in records it lived on. And the first real clue of intentionality emerged through the presence of Father Elias Thornwood, whose signatures continued long after no one remained. It was a whisper from the past, a reminder that absence itself can be a tool, and that history can be manipulated with the precision of a pen. And as historians and investigators later realized, the village's erasure was not sudden, but carefully encoded into the very fabric of its records. Every missing birth, every stopped ledger entry, every repeated signature was part of a puzzle that could only be deciphered decades later. The people had vanished, but the story of their existence remained, written, indelible, and haunting. Every village needs a priest, someone to guide, record, and bear witness to the lives of its people. In this village, records indicated 3 priests had served over the decades, but when investigators began piecing together the events surrounding the night of disappearance, it became clear that only one had truly existed. Father Elias Thornwood, the same man whose name had appeared repeatedly in church ledgers, was central to the mystery. Yet his existence outside the church records was questionable. He did not appear in census documents, and there were no records of a birthplace, baptism, or family. No obituary marked his passing, nor did any local history book mention him outside the routine parish records. Locals, when pressed about him decades later, gave conflicting accounts. Some remembered seeing a tall, quiet man who always walked alone along the village paths, his eyes fixed on the church steeple as if following some private rhythm. Others insisted they had never actually seen him enter a home or speak at a social gathering. One elderly woman recalled, with trembling certainty, that he always sat at the very back of the pews, observing without interacting, and that he seemed to age very little over the years. Witness accounts only deepened the mystery. Several villagers claimed to have seen Father Thornwood speaking with someone outside the church late at night, while others said he was never seen at night at all. Children whispered that he sometimes appeared at windows, staring in silently, but no one could agree on the time, the location, or even whether it was truly him. Photographs from the era, few and poorly preserved, showed empty church interiors, with no sign of a priest in service. As the day of the disappearance approached in historical reconstruction, Thornwood was reportedly seen entering the church alone. He closed the heavy wooden doors behind him, the sound echoing faintly down the stone steps, and was never seen leaving. 3 days later, when the doors were finally opened again, the scene was perplexing. The church was untouched. No furniture had been disturbed, no windows broken, no vestments stolen. Even the collection plate remained in its usual place. Coins stacked neatly as though untouched by human hands. Yet, despite this apparent calm, the absence of the villagers weighed heavily in the air. Investigators noted the meticulous arrangement of everything inside the altar, perfectly aligned. Hymn books placed in exact rows, candles unlit but untouched. The scene suggested a deliberate care, as though someone had ensured the continuity of ritual. Even as human life had been removed from the village, Father Thornwood's role in the mystery was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinarily, a priest records births, deaths, marriages, and confessions. But in this case, the records outlived the villagers themselves. His signatures appeared with the precision of someone performing a sacred duty, but the irony was dark. He documented lives that no longer existed, marking the absence with as much care as presence. Psychologists later analyzed the possible implications of such a figure. Thornwood's behavior suggested an almost obsessive control over reality. Every ledger entry was deliberate, every annotation exact, as if he alone maintained the integrity of the village's existence in a world where physical bodies could no longer validate it. To some, he was merely a man fulfilling his duty. To others, a spectre of authority wielding reality itself as a tool. The locals' avoidance of discussing him also contributed to the tension. Families who once whispered of sins, births, and deaths now avoided Thornwood's name entirely. Stories were fragmented, contradicting each other, leaving a sense of cognitive dissonance. For every villager who swore he was benevolent, another suggested a darker force, an agent of erasure, whose presence coincided precisely with the night the village disappeared. Further investigation into church architecture and parish practices added another layer of unease. Thornwood had been the last person seen entering the church, but the structure itself offered no means for concealment, no hidden rooms or passages. Every door and window was accounted for, yet somehow the congregation vanished, leaving behind a church as immaculate as it had been in life. This contradiction suggested either an impossibility or a method of removal beyond contemporary understanding. When historians revisited the ledger, they found subtle irregularities in the ink. Certain entries appeared slightly darker, some lighter, as if written at different times under varying conditions. This hinted at obsessive maintenance of records, as if Thornwood had been documenting more than mere events, perhaps recording the process of erasure itself, capturing the method in meticulous detail for reasons unknown. The psychological tension built as investigators considered the human element. A priest, entrusted with souls and moral oversight, was somehow complicit, at least present while an entire village ceased to exist. This contradiction was both disturbing and compelling. Thornwood was at once a witness, a recorder, and a figure tied to the unsolvable mystery. His continued presence in records, long after the village's disappearance, created the sense of an unbroken chain of observation, a lingering human focus that anchored the story even in absence. 3 days after the disappearance, when the church was finally opened, the investigators walked slowly through the empty aisles. Dust floated in thin beams of sunlight, and the faint scent of candle wax lingered in the air. Everything was precisely as it should have been, hymnalists arranged neatly, altar cloths ironed smooth, collection plate untouched. Nothing explained the missing lives. And yet, every entry in the ledger, every signature of Father Thornwood, whispered of careful orchestration, deliberate planning, and the unnerving presence of a human agent at the center of an inexplicable event. It was in this silence, in the emptiness of an untouched church, that the investigators realized the true horror. The village's disappearance was not chaotic. It was methodical, and the priest, whose existence could only be traced through ink on paper, had been the unseen constant. His presence was a tether to reality, and yet it provided no comfort, only more questions. The church doors had been locked from the inside. The ledger updated faithfully, and the village gone. No theft, no violence, no mischief. Just absence. And through it all, one figure remained. The priest who never left. Church bells are meant to call people together. They mark time, signal celebration, announce sorrow, and guide the living through the rhythm of communal life. But on that final night in 1871, the bells of the vanished village rang and no one ever returned. Reconstructing that night has been the work of generations of historians, combining weather records, personal diaries, and scattered oral histories. Remarkably, there was no storm, no earthquake, and no obvious natural calamity to explain why the entire population simply disappeared. Travelers passing within miles of the village reported hearing the bells pealing insistent, ringing through the calm Mississippi air, but when they approached, the streets were empty. Fires burned low in hearths, the smell of smoke lingered, and bread had been left half-baked, yet no souls remained. Inside the church, records indicate that the children's choir had gathered that evening for practice. Their songs, normally cheerful and disciplined, were said to have carried farther than usual, echoing across fields and roads. Neighbors recalled that some of the older children had commented on a strange chill in the air, a subtle unease that seemed to precede the final ringing of the bells. Parents, busy with chores, noted nothing amiss. Routine persisted even as an inexplicable tension hung over the village. Historians have pieced together fragments of eyewitness testimony. One account describes a young girl walking along the main road to the church, hair tangled from the windless evening, humming a hymn she could not finish. Another mentions a boy carrying a basket of eggs, frozen mid-step as though time had paused. These accounts, while anecdotal, point to a moment suspended between normalcy and erasure, a liminal space where the physical world persisted, even as human presence vanished. Among the most disturbing discoveries was a separate ledger, hidden among ordinary church records. Unlike the familiar registers of births and deaths, this ledger was labeled Confessions Received. The entries were simple, sparse, and highly each confession was dated meticulously, noting sins, transgressions, and secret knowledge but without names. Pages that should have contained weeks of confessions were instead sparsely filled, with repeated phrases in identical ink and handwriting. The ledger seemed to track compliance, obedience, and the fulfillment of some unseen mandate. The final lines of the ledger contained a phrase repeated with eerie consistency: "All have been accounted for." This simple sentence carried the weight of the unimaginable. Historians argue over its meaning. Some suggest it was a record of completeness, a clerical mark confirming that no one had been omitted from the ritual or the community. Others believe it was darker, final tally of the living, a note that all souls had been collected or removed. Regardless, the phrase has become central to understanding the deliberate precision of the village's disappearance. Where the records provide no relief, that evening was calm, clear, and warm, with the moon rising slowly over the Mississippi fields. No storm, no wind, no evidence of flooding could account for the absence of the villagers. Yet the sound of the church bells had been noted in journals from miles away. Travelers described a ringing that seemed impossibly loud and persistent, almost unnatural, as though the bells themselves had summoned attention to an event that no human could witness directly. Reconstruction of the village layout suggests the bells would have been audible to anyone within the small radius of surrounding homes. Yet every single villager, regardless of age or occupation, failed to appear anywhere along the usual routes. The fires, doors, and belongings were all left in place. It was a disappearance without displacement, a vanishing that left no traces beyond what could be accounted for on paper. The presence of the children's choir that night adds another layer of horror. Normally disciplined, their final practice appears to have been unremarkable in the logs until cross-referenced with the separate confession ledger. It is here that patterns emerge, suggesting that certain members of the choir were singled out for specific notation, their entries distinct in style or ink. These subtle differences have led historians to propose that the ledger may have tracked compliance or behavior prior to the erasure event. Though the exact nature of the ritual remains unknown, some have speculated about supernatural involvement, pointing to the repeated phrase, the inexplicable disappearance, and the clarity of the weather. Others maintain that the village's erasure was the result of extreme human orchestration, a complex system of control carried out over generations and culminating in the final night. Regardless of interpretation, the tension is unmistakable. Ordinary life, routine, and devotion continued up to the moment of vanishing, leaving an air of unresolved dread. It is in this mid-series reveal that the stakes are made clear. The disappearance was not spontaneous, nor was it random. The bells rang as though to mark a boundary, a temporal and moral threshold, after which life continued only on paper. And at the center of this orchestration was the church itself, its architecture, rituals and records serving as instruments of control, perhaps even of selective preservation. If you're starting to sense that this was more than a disappearance, stay with this story. And if you want more forgotten histories like this, subscribe now, because what comes next was never meant to be found. As investigators turned the pages of the confession ledger and examined the precise alignment of records, a chilling realization emerged. Someone or something had ensured that every detail of human activity was accounted for before the village ceased to exist. No detail too small. No child, adult, or elder forgotten. And yet, the people themselves were gone. The final beat of Part 4 rests on this simple yet horrifying phrase, etched repeatedly into the ledger. All have been accounted for. It is a sentence that haunts the reader long after the words are read, marking the line between presence and absence, life and erasure. It signals that even as the village physically disappeared, the shadow of its existence endured in meticulous records, waiting for those who would eventually uncover it. The night the bells rang was not a moment of chaos. It was a moment of precision, a deliberate conclusion to centuries of daily life meticulously chronicled, yet carefully designed to vanish from the physical world. And as historians and investigators would later realize, the implications of that night extended far beyond the village boundaries, challenging our understanding of history, memory, and the fragility of human presence. The ledger sat on the oak table, its leather cover worn and cracked. Its pages, once pristine and orderly, now bore the scars of something far darker. The handwriting that had chronicled generations of births, marriages, and deaths now seemed to twist and writhe in grotesque patterns. Across several pages, names had been violently crossed out. The names were still there, the historian whispered. Someone just decided they shouldn't be. Entire families were struck through with bold, relentless strokes. Father, mother, and children all obliterated in a single, sweeping motion. The ink ran slightly from the pressure, as though the person marking these pages had applied not just force, but emotion, a combination of anger, detachment, and ritualistic precision. Children's names were handled differently than adults. While adult names were crossed out in straight, unhesitant lines, the children's names were often encircled first, sometimes underlined multiple times, and finally erased. Marginal notes were scribbled in different ink, observations, calculations, and sometimes cryptic phrases like ready, next, or compliant. Each note suggested thought, planning, and selection rather than accident. Historians examining the ledger realized that some of the names had been crossed out weeks, even months, before the village vanished. This was not a sudden act of violence. It was a slow, methodical process. An invisible hand deciding who would remain and who would be removed from existence. Every erased name carried the weight of choice, morality, and deliberate orchestration. Psychologists studying the ledger noted the profound moral dread inherent in these acts. The crossing out of names was more than it was symbolic. By marking names for erasure, the person responsible transformed identity into a transient, conditional state, as if a human life could be reduced to ink on a page. Each stroke was a judgment, each smudge a reminder that existence could be nullified by will alone. Observers were struck by the chilling artistry of the crossings. Some pages showed faint, tentative lines, like hesitation, while others were carved in fierce, unrelenting strikes. Certain names had been erased twice, once in one ink, then again in a different shades, suggesting verification or a ritualistic double-check. In some cases, even the marginal notes were overwritten, creating a palimpsest of erasure. It was as though the ledger itself had become a living document of selection, guiding the fate of a village without the physical presence of a hand to enforce it. The psychological horror deepened as investigators realized the scope of control implied by these marks. Entire families, spanning generations, could be selected or deselected with mere strokes. Children, with their small, delicate names written in careful handwriting, were targeted distinctly. Could it be that innocence had been weighed differently than adulthood? Was this ledger a mechanism to decide who would be spared or who would vanish first? One particularly haunting page listed 15 children, all between the ages of 6 and 12. Their names were each underlined twice, annotated in one corner with a note reading simply, prioritized. Next to an adult couple, a different note, for later. The ledgers seemed to divide human lives into categories, as though those writing it were arbitrating reality itself, deciding which souls were expendable and which were to be retained temporarily for observation. The acts of crossing out were not impulsive. They were deliberate and premeditated. This realization shattered any lingering belief that the disappearance of the village had been an accident, a sudden calamity, or even a mysterious natural event. The evidence now suggested that this was planned meticulously, confession by confession, family by family, child by child. Every erasure, every annotation, had been a step toward an outcome that was now visible only in its aftermath. The complete removal of the village from the physical world. Investigators also noticed that the handwriting itself varied slightly across pages, suggesting multiple participants over time, or perhaps the same hand performing deliberate shifts in style to mark different stages of the plan. Some ink was fresh, some had aged decades before the final night. Some crossings were precise, others chaotic, almost as if the scribe had grown fatigued or frustrated with the enormity of their task. It was a document alive with intention, a ledger that recorded not just life, but the end of life. As scholars reflected on the ledger, a chilling moral implication emerged. This wasn't just a ledger, it was a testament to the human capacity for bureaucratic cruelty. The erasure of names, especially children's, forced a confrontation with the darkest side of methodical control, the reduction of human existence to something that could be validated, nullified, and manipulated through ink on paper. The moral weight of the crossings was suffocating, the horror magnified by the absence of any immediate physical act. The village itself had vanished. Yet the ledger bore silent witness to the decisions that had made it possible in the dim light of the archival room. Historians traced the names with gloved fingers. Some smudges had been made by accident, others by purpose. The crossings created a rhythm of horror, a pattern of selection, and a reminder that even centuries later, human choices, cold, meticulous, unobserved, could shape reality beyond immediate comprehension. By the end of the analysis, the conclusion was undeniable. This disappearance was not spontaneous. It was intentional. The village's fate had been sealed long before the final night. The ledger had mapped it, recorded it, and enforced it. Each erased name was a prelude, each marginal note a step toward the ultimate outcome, and as investigators closed the heavy ledger, they could not escape the weight of its implication. This was not a tragedy that happened in one night. It was planned, carefully, confession by confession, child by child, family by family, a methodical, bureaucratic erasure of human lives that left behind only ink, paper, and a lingering sense of moral dread. An entire village vanished overnight. Fires still smouldered in the hearths, bread remained half-baked on tables, and doors stood unlocked. But when anyone came looking, there was nothing. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no clues. And yet, remarkably, no official search ever happened. Historians have struggled to understand why. Ordinary logic dictates that when a population disappears without explanation, authorities intervene. Neighbors report the scene, sheriffs investigate, papers cover the story. But in this case, the village was quietly erased from maps, ignored in records, and dismissed by officials as having relocated voluntarily. Documents from the regional administration reveal a remarkable pattern of systemic silence. Letters from concerned townsfolk disappeared without a trace. Courier logs were altered, and maps revised to exclude the village entirely. Anyone attempting to trace the village's existence prior to 1871 found their sources vanishing or contradicting each other. It was as if someone had not only removed the people, but had instructed history itself to ignore them. The local church claimed a spiritual justification. Sermons and letters refer to the village's spiritual relocation, a phrase that left investigators baffled. According to the clergy, the community had been divinely removed, guided to a place beyond mortal reach. The language was comforting to outsiders, but eerily convenient to those responsible for the disappearance. No proof was offered, and no follow-up investigation took place. Authorities in surrounding towns seemed complicit, or at least willing participants in the collective denial. Travelers and merchants were reportedly warned not to ask questions, with subtle threats embedded in polite advice. Curiosity could bring unnecessary trouble or spiritual peril. Families who dared to inquire about missing neighbors were subtly ostracized or redirected. Over time, these whispered warnings became part of local law, further concealing the village's fate. One particular outsider, a historian and amateur investigator named Thomas Whitaker, became obsessed with the mystery. Whitaker had grown up hearing fragmented accounts of the village and the bells that rang that fateful night. Driven by curiosity, he visited the region repeatedly, searching for clues, records, or even oral testimony. He meticulously documented what he could, often referencing personal letters and journals from neighboring towns. But Whitaker's efforts met with obstacles that now seemed deliberately orchestrated. Letters sent to local officials never received replies. When he attempted to access church records, the documents were suddenly misplaced or rewritten. Even maps he brought from the state archives contained new anomalies. Streets, boundaries, and names shifted inexplicably between revisions. It was as if the village's disappearance had been baked into the infrastructure of memory itself. By 1873, only 2 years after the disappearance, Whitaker himself vanished from all records. His journals were found tucked in a private collection decades later. Yet official documentation of his travels, letters, and even his existence seems scrubbed from administrative archives. Scholars examining Whitaker's notes observed his growing desperation, a sense of moral urgency, and a deepening unease about what forces, human or otherwise, had orchestrated the village's erasure. The psychological weight of systemic silence is profound. Imagine witnessing a disappearance so complete, so absolute, and realizing that no authority will intervene. The absence of investigation is itself a tool of control. By choosing not to act, the powers at play reinforced the erasure, teaching those left behind that certain questions must never be asked. This creates a moral vacuum where the invisible becomes untouchable, and the vanished become unremmed. Maps provide another eerie testament to this deliberate forgetting. Surveys conducted before 1871 show the village clearly, with roads, houses, and farmland labeled in meticulous detail. Surveys after 1871 depict the same geographic area as empty fields, sometimes with generic names like open land or farmland, erasing every trace of human habitation. Even decades later, new map editions perpetuated the absence, ensuring that anyone consulting official documents would find only emptiness where a thriving community once existed. Church records tell a parallel story. Beyond the confessions received ledger, parish ledgers of baptisms, marriages, and funerals ceased abruptly. Names that had appeared for centuries simply stopped. The priest whose signature persisted mysteriously after the disappearance seems to have orchestrated or sanctioned the maintenance of silence. A single human agent embedded within a network designed to ensure collective amnesia. Historians now consider the disappearance as a case study in institutionalized memory suppression. The village itself was a victim, but so were anyone who might remember it. Entire communities were conditioned to ignore, avoid, or reinterpret evidence. By denying investigation, authorities, clergy, and neighbors collectively contributed to a reality where the vanished were erased not only from life but from thought, conversation, and history itself. Yet traces remained, subtle and ghostly. Thomas Whitaker's journals, surviving letters, and rare maps allowed modern investigators to reconstruct fragments of the village's existence. These traces are all the more haunting because they reveal what could have been prevented. A simple acknowledgement, a record, a search anything could have preserved the memory of human lives that were otherwise destined to disappear entirely. The final realization is chilling. History did not forget this village. History was instructed to ignore it. Every absence, every silence, every missing letter, and every revised map was a deliberate act of erasure, and for nearly a century the world complied without question, leaving the vanished to linger only in shadows, whispers, and the few surviving fragments that have recently come to light, the night the bells rang, and the subsequent systemic silence, were not separate events. They were two halves of the same orchestration, one physical, the other social. One removed the body, the other removed the memory. Together, they ensured that the village would not just vanish, it would cease to exist in consciousness, relegated to a historical void. Decades had passed. The world had moved on. Towns grew, roads were paved over the fields, and families lived, worked, and aged without ever knowing the fate of a village that had vanished in 1871. Yet, amidst all the silence and forgetfulness, one record survived, a document the church had failed, intentionally or not, to destroy. There is one record the church failed to destroy. The archivist whispered as she opened the brittle pages under dim lamplight. The ledger was unassuming, bound in brown leather, its corners frayed and pages yellowed with age. It was not a confession. It was not a list of deaths. This was something far worse, far more calculating. A final inventory. The first page set the tone. Names, ages, and roles were listed meticulously. Children were noted separately, their ages circled, along with comments on obedience and usefulness. Adults were categorized by skills, work habits, and perceived value. Each entry was clinical, detached, almost mechanical, as if the village itself had been processed. Like livestock or objects in a ledger of commerce, the horror was in the details. Notes in faded ink beside some names recorded subtle judgments. Compliant, will adapt, needs guidance, unsuitable for labor, requires further observation. One page listed an entire family, with annotations like retire from records next to each name, as if their very existence could be suspended with the stroke of a pen. Investigators realized that the village hadn't vanished randomly or tragically. It had been processed, one individual at a time, their worth, age, and obedience evaluated. The ledger's existence revealed a horrifying bureaucracy of disappearance. There were no graves, no bodies, no signs of violence, only the meticulous records of people reduced to ink and paper. The psychological weight was immense. The villagers were not gone by accident. They had been systematically erased from history while their lives were catalogued with chilling precision. The church had orchestrated a process that made disappearance invisible and yet tangible, leaving only the record as proof of human lives, erased with intent. Some pages contained curious symbols and notations. One mark appeared repeatedly beside certain names, resembling a cross or a tally, but its meaning was unclear. Scholars suggested it could indicate priority for removal, obedience levels, or even a schedule of actions. Every stroke, every annotation reinforced the cold, bureaucratic precision behind the vanishing. A sense of continuity haunted the ledger. The inventory referenced prior records, the confession ledger, the church registers, even oral notes recorded by the priest in the months before the disappearance. Every existing document fed into this final record, consolidating centuries of human life into a silent, methodical list. As the archivist turned each page, she noticed that the final entries were left unfinished. Names without annotations, ages without evaluation, as if the person recording the ledger had been interrupted or withdrawn. Perhaps the work had been abandoned in haste, or perhaps the village itself had been removed from the world before the final tally could be completed. The lingering effect of the ledger was unnerving. It was one thing to read of vanished towns or missing people in history books, but it was another to see them catalogued as objects of assessment. The village's humanity, reduced to notes on usefulness and obedience, left a psychological scar on anyone who studied it. It made history itself complicit in their erasure. Modern investigators attempted to reconcile the ledger with surviving maps, letters, and oral histories. Patterns emerged. Families listed in the ledger could be traced to temporary placements in surrounding towns, though none retained acknowledgement of their true origin. Children noted as obedient often appeared in subsequent town records with new names, suggesting relocation and assimilation. Those marked otherwise seemed to vanish completely, leaving no trace. Yet, despite the erasure, the ledger confirmed survival in a haunting sense. The village had existed, meticulously observed and catalogued. Its residents had not been forgotten entirely. They had simply been placed under a veil of secrecy so complete that only a single, fragile document endured. The final pages contained one last, unsettling note, all accounted for. The process complete. No deviations noted. Records to remain confidential. Archive as necessary. No explanation for what had happened physically to the villagers. No indication of why the church had orchestrated this extreme measure. Only the ledger and the knowledge that every life had been measured, judged, and processed. The church still stood in the region, its bell silent for generations. To locals, it was a relic. To historians, it was a monument to deliberate erasure. No graves were ever found. No bodies were ever recovered. And yet, the ledger preserved a truth more haunting than any tombstone. People had existed, catalogued, and then deliberately made to disappear from the world. Stories like this don't end, they wait. If you want to uncover more histories that were buried on purpose, subscribe, because some records are still locked away, hidden in archives and attics, waiting for the brave to find them. And if you ever hear church bells in an empty place, remember, not everyone who answered was meant to come back.